Well, I'm confused by it. I've read your piece. Your piece is quite convincing. You're saying that Trump isn't quite as mad as he seems in slapping these tariffs on everyone. So let's go over what he is actually doing. So it's 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% levy on Chinese goods. And he says he absolutely intends to impose tariffs on the European Union as well.
Isn't that just a butt in here? It's like that slight sort of bully thing. So he's sort of hit the two people that really can't affect him. But China, he's gone, but not quite as much.
Yeah, well, I've
anyway,
got a problem
get on
with
to
that.
that a
We'll
bit
get
later.
on to that in a minute. How about us, though? How about little old Blighty? How do we fare? Well, he was coming back from a trip to Florida. No, he was coming back from his weekend at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And he was asked that very question by a reporter, and this is what he said.
Well, we're going to see what happens. It'll happen, but we'll see how things work out. It might happen with them, but it will definitely happen with the European Union. I can tell you that, because they've really taken advantage of us. And, we have over a $300 billion deficit. They don't take our cars. They don't take our farm products. They take almost nothing. And we take everything from them, millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products. So the UK is way out of line, and we'll see the UK, but European Union is really out of line. UK is out of line, but I'm sure I think that one can be worked out. But the European Union it's an atrocity, what they've done. Well, Prime Minister Starmer has been very nice. We've had a couple of meetings. We've had numerous phone calls. We're getting along very well. And we'll see whether or not we can balance out our budget. With the European Union, it's a $350 billion deficit. So obviously something's going to take place there.
Thank God for Brexit, eh? We're separated from the EU. We're separated from the European Union and protected from Trumpism.
Hallelujah. And I think, Tim, you've often pointed out that Trump probably isn't all that clear how important the UK is or where it is in relationship with the EU at some point. So maybe he seems to be slightly sometimes
but
mixing
he seems
those
to like us. That's it. You can tell there's a back room of the brain which is going, but I like them. So, okay, they might get away with it. You can tell that whenever he discusses Britain, he always says, but I like them.
Just very quickly on this 300 billion. What trade relationships between countries find very difficult to price is banking relationships and tech relationships. And America gets huge advantage with its huge banking sector, which operates around the world, and its incredibly powerful tech platforms, Alphabet, Google, YouTube, Amazon, Meta, etc., all around the world. So just to give a little bit of, it does sound appalling. There's this huge goods trade deficit. They don't take our cars. It's all appalling. Yeah. Just remember, there's a huge value to America of its two biggest service outputs, which is banking and technology.
But we can get into this.
We can.
But the point that my first comeback to you on that is, in the event of a war, what do you want? Steel industry or banking sector?
I would say tech platforms and capital markets, Tim, to be honest, in a war.
Okay, fine. But you see, Trump is an analog man.
Right, maybe
so
he is.
He doesn't particularly care that America might be number one in selling travel insurance to the Malaysians. What he's thinking is, I want steel.
Yeah, but he doesn't like us attacking his tech platform, as he's always warning us. Camilla, yes.
I'm just thinking whenever we think about trade surpluses, we kind of think, in my mind, I think about what's Britain exporting: whiskey, some sparkling wine, some cheese. And then we think about the Germans and we just think of cars. There is something quite weird about the fact that they're, apart from the candy stores, if I can call it that, that have cropped up around Victoria.
Yeah.
Somewhat suspiciously.
Visibly, we see far more European goods and labels here, apart from your whole tech bro point, than we do American stuff. People aren't driving around in the UK in Chevrolets, are they? They're driving around in Audis. And if you were in America, you could understand it. I perfectly get the point when it comes to China, because I completely see that there is something hugely oxymoronic about the nature of the modern world going on about slavery and poor working conditions, and then just accepting the likes of Shein and Temu dumping a load of ridiculously cheap crap, frankly, on our economies. That jeopardizes our own retail sector. You could use the same example as well with China when it comes to, funny enough, sorry to name drop, was discussing this with James Dyson the other day, and he was complaining at China completely disrespecting intellectual property, knocking off cheap air wraps and vacuums, paying him no heed whatsoever for his own inventions, flooding the market with that kind of stuff, and literally doing it with impunity, like nothing can stop them. So I get the China thing, but I would have reversed those figures. I'd have put 25% on China if I was going to do this, and we can discuss whether we should be doing it at all, and not penalising Mexico and Canada, your own neighbours, that much.
Should we just go through the reactions? Let's just go through the reaction of world leaders. Before, Tim, we come to your argument, which is so brilliantly put in your column, which I see has already got nearly 3,200 comments.
Yes, 4 positive.
yes, mostly the Stanley family members. Yes, but let's just go through. So on Canada, this is Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, responding to what Donald Trump has said about Canada and those 25% import tariffs.
First, I want to speak directly to Americans, our closest friends and neighbours. This is a choice that, yes, will harm Canadians, but beyond that, it will have real consequences for you, the American people. As I have consistently said, tariffs against Canada will put your jobs at risk, potentially shutting down American auto assembly plants and other manufacturing facilities. They will raise costs for you, including food at the grocery store, gas at the pump. They will impede your access to an affordable supply of vital goods crucial for U.S. security, such as nickel, potash, uranium, steel, and aluminum. Tonight, I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. This will include immediate tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods as of Tuesday, followed by further tariffs on $125 billion worth of American products in 21 days' time to allow Canadian companies and supply chains to seek to find alternatives.
Justin Trudeau already vowed retaliatory tariffs on US imports, and hold on a minute, fans of the Toronto Raptors NBA team and of the Ottawa and Calgary NHL teams, who were all playing American opposition at the weekend, roundly booed the Star-Spangled Banner when it was sung. So this has already entered the sporting arena. And also Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, who is running to become the new Liberal leader and then presumably the loser of the next election in Canada, because the Liberals are so far behind in Canada. He came out eating his 4 Weetabix, didn't he, on Newsnight, saying he doesn't scare us. So Canada is showing its big muscles. They're not just the Mounties, also the politicians.
Although I tell you who I'd back in a fight between Trump and Carney. Come on, Mr. Romaniac, quantitative easer.
And then Mexico,
who else has responded badly?
Claudia
Mexico.
Sheinbaum. She's also hit back at Donald Trump's slanderous claim that he was introducing tariffs because her government had joined forces with drug bosses. She also said there would be retaliatory tariffs on American imports. But Tim, brilliant piece as ever, such an elegant writer. What's your argument that this is something that actually could lead to good outcomes, not just for America, but possibly for all of us?
Well, I tried in the column to see it from Trump's point of view, and his perspective is that we are at a crossroads in history, a moment at which the United States is losing power, and it's losing the race, as far as he sees it, and it's about to be overtaken by China. And unless you have a dramatic reset on all fronts, immigration, crime, woke, and trade, then he believes they're going to get eclipsed by the Chinese, and they're going to lose this great race. So his view on trade is right now we're getting screwed by the rest of the world. We have a trade deficit of around $773 billion. At the same time, America is spending close to $1 trillion in order to protect the Western world. So while we're defending the West is getting rich selling goods to Americans. And he believes that's because of a number of treaties which have been bad for America, like NAFTA. It's because other countries aren't playing by rules and they're being hypocritical. So, for instance, the European Union protects its markets. It slaps a tax of up to 10% on US car imports. And he's saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebalance that by the use of tariffs. Now, the interesting question is he doing this in order to compel other countries to behave as he sees it? Or is he doing it because he wants, in the long run, these tariffs to become a feature of the American economy in order to rebalance the way the government is funded away from income taxes and towards import taxes? Now, the short-term political attack, I think, does make a lot of sense. Because if you consider the other issue which is important for all this isn't just trade, it's immigration. Mm-hmm. And he believes that the US border, which is long and difficult to police, it has become just a magnet for illegal migrants and also for drugs. The drugs, by the way, a large amount of them are being sent from China in the mail to Mexico, where they get turned to the substance, which is then shipped across the border by drug cartels. So, for instance, what he's saying to Mexico is, you're not protecting your border. I'll hit you with these tariffs unless you properly protect the border and stop the flow of the drugs and the people. He says the same is true of Canada. Canada protests, actually, we've been working very hard with you to try and stop narcotics. Whatever, in Trump's head, Canada is also a place where the border is too fungible and they need to police it better. So the issue is he using the threat of tariffs to compel governments to fall in line and respect America's authority, to change the way that they import U.S. goods, to work better to control immigration? Or is he actually seeking, in the long run, as I say, to cut income taxes and other domestic taxes in order to shift the balance away from taxing productivity and work towards taxing imports? That's the interesting question, and that might be the difference between Trump Mark I, which is where really the tariffs became a political thing, because that's what Republicans are more comfortable with, and Trump Mark II, where he might be trying to actually change the nature of the American economy. I just want to add one more thing. The frustrating thing always with Trump is he does things in shock and awe. He does them in an almost biblical way. I mean, I love that line from his interview where he talked about what the EU is doing. It's an atrocity. I've started sending that to people, a photograph of it, whatever it is. When my mum says, you said you would be in at 7 and you're in at 8, I reply with, it's an atrocity.
Or send it to all the levers in your life.
But the reality is across the world, people protect their trade. The EU does it. Biden did it. Joe Biden did it. Joe Biden slapped, get this, a 100% tax on imports of Chinese electric cars. That's one reason why America is not speeding ahead in the electric car race. It could be importing cheaper Chinese cars. It's not. Why did Biden do that? He did it because he said, it's a strategic issue. We need to protect new industries which are emerging, like the U.S. electric cars market. And he also put taxes up on things like steel products, because we need to have certain industries in America. We can't have them all being produced in the developing world. So Trump does it, and he does it in his own operatic way. I get that. But the reality is everyone else does it. And by the way, why is it... See, this I find this curious. Why does no one ever accuse the EU of moral hypocrisy on tariffs? And the reason for that, I think, is this. America is perceived as the font of liberty. That its message isn't just for Americans, but it's for all mankind, of liberalism, freedom, free markets, etc. So whenever America does something that seems to contradict that, people call it out. When the EU does something that contradicts its supposed foundational liberal values, no one calls it out.
Well,
why?
We do.
Because we do. But people don't call it out because the EU does not have that sense of guiding ideology and philosophy. It's a protectionist union to protect Italian wine.
Yes,
right?
And German
Whereas
cars.
when America does
and
it...
French cheese.
Right, okay, but that's what it is there to do.
One point that Tim just made there, and sorry, this is slightly facile, but it's kind of in tune with the whole US-Canada mashup.
Yeah.
When you just said that thing about, is it just performative politics, respect my authority, I've just realised that Donald Trump is the human personification of Cartman from South Park.
Respect my authority.
You must respect my authority. And that is what it is about, isn't it? It's about him like hitting the ground running. I mean, I actually think his first 2 weeks have been slightly mad, not least with the whole DEI was to blame for the helicopter and plane crash over DC. But we digress. This is just about him throwing his extraordinary weight around the world and making sure that the Ursula von der Leyens and the Justin Trudeau's of this world know their place. Some of it towards Canada is just, I think, a degree of vindictiveness because he finds Trudeau to be irretrievably woke and hates everything he stands for. Although I note that the person who's probably going to replace Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre, is absolutely aligned with the Canadian Prime Minister on this issue of protecting Canada's interests and literally turning around and going, what are you doing? You're our closest ally in the world. This is so self-destructive.
I would say that the reason that Donald Trump can throw his weight around is because of the size and effects globally of the US economy, which has been built on free trade. The fact is that when they were protectionist in the late 19th century, McKinley, who's one of his heroes, one of Trump's heroes, was president, was a protectionist, brought in tariffs, had to eventually abandon tariffs because they were so unpopular. Since then, free trade has been the driver of the American economy and is the reason Trump today can throw his weight around. It does seem to me to be a short-term political message to the world. Look at the result he got from Colombia. He demanded that Colombia took illegal immigrants back. Colombia refused. Trump said, I'm going to slap taxes on everything you do with America, tariffs on everything you do with America. Colombia folded immediately and even, I think, sent the president's own plane to the US to collect illegal immigrants to take them back. So Trump goes, he's a transactional president. I don't think he's a long-term strategic president. And I don't say that as a criticism. I just say that's how he operates. The big problem ultimately with changing your tax base from people in America who are paid wages and then pay tax, that to a large extent is under your control. Your trade with the rest of the world is at risk because those other countries can decide we're not going to send our cars to America. So the idea that somehow you put a tariff on something and the trade stays the same, but and our income will grow because we put tariffs on is exactly the same mistake that Rachel Reeves has made here on a much smaller scale, saying, well, we'll tax alcohol here higher. That will increase revenue to the Treasury. What has it done? It's had exactly the opposite effect because global trade is movable. And so the providers of goods and services to America decide, actually, we're not going to send them to America anymore. And then America is exposed to tax volatility because of tariffs. That is why all Western democracies have moved to an income tax system and VAT, because you can control you're controlling your population rather than trying to control trade with Germany.
But the EU keeps on sending stuff regardless because it's economically become somewhat of a basket case and needs the trade with America.
Yes, but it's still affected. And I think, Tim, to your point, there has been an argument, I think, on the liberal side of the debate as well as the right-wing side of the debate. The common agricultural policy of the EU has been criticised for decades as being a way of protecting Italian wine, particularly French agricultural goods. It's not a zero-sum game. The world is not either tariff-free or tariffs. Of course, you have some protectionist measures. But if you go too far on protectionist measures, what you get in-country is inflation. And what was Trump voted in on? The Democrats had failed on prices. J.D. Vance's point, vote Trump, get cheaper eggs. Well, eggs, nothing to do with tariffs, actually, to do with bird flu, are now at record prices in America.
How much is a dozen eggs in America?
A dozen eggs, I think, is about $12.
What?
I know. Unbelievable.
$1 per egg?
Yes. So the problem that Trump's going to get trapped in is the problem that Biden got trapped in. If you cannot control inflation, the voters will turn against you. Not Trudeau, not the leader of Mexico, not even Xi Jinping. In the end, the voters say, if you are making me poorer because we are importing inflation, because goods from around the world are going up in price, Trump will pay the price for that.
Well, Trump is saying, well, first of all, Trump is not running for re-election, so who cares? This is his chance as a one-term president to, as I say, reset the economy and society as he believes needs to be done. Secondly, he would say that any increase in the cost of imports, he has acknowledged, bravely, he has basically acknowledged will happen. He has said this is going to cause pain. But he believes in the longer run that can be offset both by increasing the productive capabilities of America, things like AI, automation, etc., and also by cutting taxes, by digging fossil fuels out of the ground and by generating a domestic boom. I mean, everything you've said about the problem of free trade, I agree in relation to a small country such as ours. The thing about America is no one's ever going to not want to sell to America. It remains the world's buyer, basically. Everyone's got to trade with America. And because it is so big and because it has natural resources, and it has a large population, it can do this stuff. It can take this gamble in a way Britain cannot. But to your point, I mean, if you compare in the 1980s, you see for a while Japan tried to do what America is doing, and it worked very well. Japan basically manipulated its economy such that it could export to America. And this began to hit American manufacturers. And then Reagan came in the 80s. And actually, people think, well, Reagan was a free trade fanatic. He wasn't. One country he decided to protect against was Japan. And it screwed the Japanese economy. It hit them very hard. And they never quite recovered. So that is the problem, is if you do play this game of hardball, well, other people might sort of raise the tariffs against you. America did well in the 19th century with protectionism, in part because there was another country in the world which then was playing the role of America, and it was us. We were practicing free trade. We were willing to import. And also, dumb schmucks that we were, for some reason we were willing to provide the money for the Navy and the Empire that would guarantee freedom and free commerce in the world, right? We were out there fighting.
That was good for us, Tim.
It was good.
We wanted free commerce around the world because it made us. It made us, Tim. It made us. And just one point on America in the 19th century. That was built on massive technological revolutions, the railroad and the telephone.
Yes.
And the third thing was huge amounts of immigration of cheap labour. That is no longer available to Trump because Trump is also saying, at the same time as raising tariffs, I want to reduce immigration and actually start deporting workforces.
Yeah.
So he is in a very different position from the leaders of 19th century America.
You see, Trump is the articulation of a historical consciousness. I think much of what he's doing, and this is the weird thing, is he gives no indication that he actually knows what it is he's articulating. I think someone has come along later and said to him, have you heard of this guy called William McKinley? And he said, he sounds good, I'll take him. But I don't think he actually realizes what it is he's articulating. And what he's articulating is this sense that before the 1930s, before the Great Deal, America had struck this formula for how to be great. And it was limited immigration, tariffs to protect your domestic industry, and you keep out of wars. So basically you erect a wall around the country. And within that country, you grow and you're stable. And because you don't have immigration, you have social harmony. And because you have the tariffs, you can protect your industry so they can grow. And because you don't go to war, unlike Britain and the idiots in Europe, then you don't have to waste money on the military. There was a sense that America could get rich out of that, and it did for a very long period. And he's the expression of that historical consciousness. What is the ultimate goal of Trump's policy? It is that Americans can live in families where one income provider, preferably the man, raises a big family. That's the goal. And everything about your economic policy and social policy is designed about recreating that halcyon idea of a bourgeois Christian America in which dads raised big family, mum stayed at home, and they could all live off on one salary, basically untouched by the federal government.
All right, Poldark America. Can I just remind people of who McKinley was, because I, in an earlier editorial conference, confused him with the consultancy firm McKinsey. So President William McKinley is somebody who Trump has cited as his own political hero. He has said we were at our richest from 1870 to 1913. That's when we were a tariff country. McKinley was a president who annexed Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So we can see some echoes of that, can't we?
Yeah.
Give me
what he's announced so
Greenland.
far.
Yes.
He was a protectionist. Obviously, he believed in high tariffs. He presided over America's overtaking of Britain as the world's leading industrial power. At the time, these were the glory days, weren't they, chaps? There was no income tax. So most revenue came from tariffs. In his second term, he moved away from strict protectionism and favoured reciprocity. You're saying that was a necessity because he realised that
he realised,
backfired.
A, he was importing inflation, and B, people were very angry about that. C, it was seen as a way of protecting. It was protectionist for big business, not for small traders. And that's been quite similar, actually, in our EU debates in this country. leaving the EU, big businesses can get around all the new laws and they can go to different markets. Small businesses that exported into the EU have been much more affected because they just don't have the depth of legal abilities and support to be able to keep trading via the free trade deal that we now have. So actually in America, McKinley got a backlash from smaller businesses that were trying to export.
Trump wants to name a mountain after him.
Well, he has done it, hasn't he?
Because
Obama went back. Yes.
It was a mountain.
The Alaskans lobbied
Yes.
for years to change the name to Denali, which is a local a Native American name.
Yes.
And interestingly, this was only prevented by the Ohio congressional delegation because McKinley was an Ohioan. So Trump then comes in and says, and we're going to change it back to McKinley, assuming that the Alaskans want that, not realizing the Alaskans have been asking for years for it to be called something else.
Oh.
So it's a classic example of Trumpism, of him assuming this is what everyone wants and it'll be wildly popular, and then discovering his own party actually doesn't.
On your eggs theory,
yes.
by the way, on
Yes.
inflation, then do we think that the reason why he's been more moderate in his approach to China
Yes,
is that
of
we
course
are
it
in
is.
this vicious cycle of, on one hand, trying to penalise China
Yeah.
for producing such low-cost goods on the back of, let's be honest, either very cheap or actual slave labour. Sorry to channel my inner Ian Duncan Smith, but we know what's going on in these factories, right? We know how they're abusing,
Yes.
particularly the Uyghur Muslims.
Yes.
But at the same time, if they don't have cheaper goods flowing in from China, it's going to push all prices up, and then your dozen eggs is going to go from $12 to
China,
$15.
yes,
Yeah.
China has been a massive exporter of deflation for decades, and we have all in the West been advantaged by that because interest rates and inflation have been at hyper low levels for years, and a lot of that can be traced back to China. China is also a huge investor in America. If you want to buy machinery, if you want to get into the debt markets, you need to be friendly with China. And also, frankly, China is a centrally controlled economy. It can depreciate the value of its currency and beat any tariff America puts on it in any case, which is what Japan did in the 1980s. It had a very weak yen policy, which is why all the goods flooded into Europe as well as into America, and we could all get our new Sony TVs, which was actually quite good for consumers because suddenly televisions were usable by people who were much poorer than had been the case before.
So the free trade argument goes that, for example, China can produce dirt cheap steel in vast quantities.
Yes.
Why protect your domestic markets? Why not buy the cheap Chinese steel? Because that means you can make cars in this country. So you might lose one industry like steel making, but you'll gain another high-tech industry because you'll be able to use this cheap steel. And in the short run, that makes sense. But it's a Faustian bargain, isn't it? Because the day comes when you realize, I haven't got a steel industry.
Yes.
And we're moving in this country to the point where you don't. And what happens, see, all of this working is based upon the well-intentioned liberal globalist idea that human beings fundamentally want to get along and want to get rich in cooperation with each other. They don't. The history of the world, the history of the last few years is that Russia, against its own economic interests and common sense, has attempted to annex a sovereign country, resulting potentially in its long-run economic humiliation. I mean, it may well have been able to militarize its economy, but that is proof that you can never escape the fact that human beings want to beat and dominate each other. States especially so. Old-fashioned great power states like the Russian Empire or the Chinese Middle Kingdom, doubly so. So we have in this Faustian bargain allowed them to get rich and develop these very strategically powerful economies based upon natural resources and steel production. What happens when we reach the day when China says, well, now we'd like to corner the market in microchips, and we're going to do that by taking Taiwan.
Wow.
And what are you people going to do to stop us? Because, by the way, we control all the strategic materials that you would need to fight us. It's a Faustian bargain. That's Trump's argument.
That is Trump's argument. I think that there are lots of weaknesses in it. I think something that shows that this can turn on a dime, I think we would say, wouldn't we? Because
Yes.
we're talking about America. Just trying to struggle. What's the American equivalent of a sixpence? A dime. In the first Trump presidency, I remember interviewing Steve Mnuchin, who was the Treasury Secretary. I interviewed him in 2018 about a free trade deal with the UK once we'd left the European Union. I also interviewed the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, as I say, a year earlier. And that was all about Trump pro-free trade, once the UK had released itself from the European Union. So I get, Tim, your argument that Trump may have this slight dream idea of this sort of, I would say, even 18th century America in a very different way. We all live like the Amish, and we all have sort of a few goats and some chickens, and we all wear smocks, and that's all lovely.
Sounds ideal.
Absolutely. I think, though, that once the effects, it's not about going to war, Tim. In the end, consumers who are voters vote against presidents, prime ministers, governments where prices are going up. We have gained so much from free trade around the world, not just us as Western democracies, the UK and elsewhere, but also the whole riches of the globe have been increased by the fact that we trade with each other. What I don't understand about the
that's controversial at least. You know that's controversial.
It can be.
That is the case of China. But the thing is, China is on the graphs, it looks like it's lifted all boats, but it's primarily lifted its own boat. There are a lot of countries that have got screwed over by free trade.
But if you look at the post the Second World War, South Korea, Japan, Germany only were able, because of the agreement led by America, that there would be a free trade world. We saved ourselves from the destruction of the Second World War.
Because America paid for their military protection.
Yes, and it's a deal. But it's a deal, Tim. It's an absolute deal. But just a point I want to make. I don't understand why we've become so squeamish about free markets and competition across borders. If another country is better at making something at a cheaper price, it doesn't mean you have to wipe out your own industry in that area, but it does mean that might mean that you can concentrate on other areas. We don't all have to be expert at everything.
But
it is not necessary.
But we don't want to squander our own reputation and almost our own history and heritage for producing things or being a world leader. So I'm listening to all this and I'm feeling a bit sorry right now and a bit depressed for dear old Blighty, because you're saying, well, you know, unfortunately our steel making industry is not as competitive as China's, and therefore we should probably put that on the back burner. We already are, aren't we? Basically our steel making industry is almost over in this country. We have to accept that. We then look to our car making. We see the Vauxhall plant in Luton near me closed down. So, oh God, we're not very good at making cars anymore. And there's a cost of living crisis, so we can't even afford Germans. So we're probably going to have to buy South Korean, and that's okay. We all like Hyundais and Kias, but oh gosh, no more Vauxhalls. And then we look at farming. And we say to ourselves, okay, let's welcome this big, fat, free trade deal with America, but a little like flooding the market with New Zealand lamb back in the day. This is a bit awkward because we don't really want to put our cattle farmers out of business, not least when they're being absolutely screwed by the Labour government. So and I'm saying this as a proponent of capitalism. There's the economics of it all, and then there's just the optics of it all.
Exactly, and this is where the debate moves from economics to philosophy, because it's a matter of sovereignty, to be able to feed yourself and protect yourself, right? Those should be a couple of fundamental things that for a nation to truly be independent, it should be able to do. In the case of Brexit Britain, if we were to leave the EU, but in some way just divest ourselves completely of our farming and our industry, to the point where we're just some kind of trade node in the world, what kind of sovereignty, what kind of practical sovereignty would we really have? But also, a nation is defined not just by the health of its markets or by how its consumers feel or the rate of its inflation. I mean, Kamal, you mock this idea of America being like the Amish. Well, that's actually what America was supposed to be when it gained its independence. That was the Jeffersonian ideal.
I didn't mock it.
It was supposed to be.
I didn't mock it. I was just making a light
but
point.
that is what America is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be a land of independent farmers, of people who have an individual as well as a national sovereignty, who are able to feed themselves and make their own stuff. I know it's idealistic and silly, but it is America's self-image. And I think, back to this question of why is he hitting Mexico and Canada in such a big way, a lot of this comes back to NAFTA in the 1990s. And I think that much of the history of American politics hinges on the fact that by some sheer chance, its first in the nation primary is New Hampshire. New Hampshire used to be a solid conservative Republican state that was heavily industrial and based a lot of its economy on things like logging. And after NAFTA, New Hampshire just lost all those jobs.
Explain NAFTA, Tim.
NAFTA is a North American free trade agreement between America, Canada, and Mexico, which lowered tariffs and the critics of it would say allowed a lot of jobs to then move, industrial jobs to move to Canada and to
very,
Mexico.
very cheap oil, which allowed America to grow rapidly
Right.
because of the fact that its gas is so cheap because of its imports from
But
Canada.
let me just finish this point because it's important about the question of Trump's motivations. By some historical quirk, the first in the nation primary for both parties, presidential primary, is New Hampshire, which has meant that for the last 30 years, presidential candidates who want to win that state have classically been anti-free trade. They've all hammered that issue. Where did Trump win in 2016? He lost Iowa. His first big victory was New Hampshire on an anti-free trade platform. So I think because different sections of society benefit and lose from free trade, but the perception in New Hampshire is we just got annihilated by NAFTA. And so by this quirk of history, whoever gets the nomination tends to be a critic of free trade because they've got to win New Hampshire if they want to have the momentum to win the rest of the primary.
But here's the practical rub. If the Canadian and Mexican economy suffers badly from this, you're inevitably going to get more workers wanting to cross the border to more prosperous America. So it doesn't really solve the immigration issue at all. When it comes to Mexico particularly, that's going to be totally counterintuitive, isn't it?
Well, and with the rest of the world, because it does create. If you start becoming isolationist and thinking that if America just starts operating within its own economy, you are right, Tim. That will mean that America may be able to keep functioning and keep going on, but the rest of the world, in comparison, may sink, which will increase immigration pressure on America, and then it's got to decide, what kind of role, if any, does it want to play in the world.
But I'd come back to that with, if that's the case, if free trade's been so great for everyone and we're all doing so well, why are millions of people trying to get into America?
Well,
why
maybe
does
free
no
trade.
one want to stay in Haiti?
Yeah, but lots of complicated reasons for that, Tim. On the point of, just to get to this point of fuel and how much cheap gasoline has supported the American economy, the fact is that America can't actually refine the oil it gets from shale gas in its own country. So it exports a lot of oil and it imports a lot of heavy oil from Canada and from Mexico. Mm-hmm. Those prices are already going up. The price of gas will also go up. I think the philosophical positioning, it sounds romantic and interesting. But the problem is, when you come down to it, what people worry about is the bills at the end of the week. They don't really care that much about the philosophical debate about wither our nation. They do care if they're a plumber in Idaho and it costs them 15%, 20% more to fill up their van, fill up their truck to go on their work, and that cuts into their margin, and they have to let a couple of guys go because they can no longer afford it. That is the effect of tariffs. And I believe that in the end, voters will lean towards, I need things to be cheap enough so that I can support my family and support creation of jobs.
Yeah, and you may well be right. When I came to write this column, I looked in vain for a single piece of commentary online that agreed with me. I couldn't find it on left-wing or right-wing websites. Right? This is such a niche view, and it could be the part of the stool of no war, no immigration, no free trade. That could be the weakest part of Trump's stool. And I'm constantly racking my brains trying to think who within the administration is pushing for this. It all seems to come from Trump, and it could be the one thing that the voters say, we don't want that. Because much of Trumpism is about a return to normalcy. It's about getting rid of woke. It's about getting rid of an overbearing government, etc. It's not about something revolutionary that's shaking things up. But this is the one part of his agenda which I think is genuinely a revolutionary experiment, and we will see what happens.
Maybe it's just because he's got the life and times of McKinley on his Audible at the moment. and
hopefully
anything could change in a couple of weeks' time.
Not confusing them with the life and times of McKinsey.
Indeed.